The passengers of Flight 782 never saw it coming. One moment the cabin was filled with soft chatter, the hum of the engines, and the gentle rustle of snack wrappers. The next, shouts, screams, and the unmistakable terror of masked men storming the aisle with guns raised. Panic hit the plane like a shockwave. People ducked, mothers shielded their children, and a flight attendant stumbled backward as a hijacker grabbed her by the arm and shoved her into a seat. At 34,000 feet, the world below meant nothing. Every life on board hung in the hands of ruthless men who barked orders in harsh voices. But as the chaos spread like wildfire, one strange detail stood out not to the passengers, but to the pilot watching through the cabin camera. Amid the trembling, crying, frozen crowd, one woman sat perfectly still, not a flinch, not a whimper. Her eyes were calm, almost calculating. It was as if she had stepped out of a different world entirely. And the pilot couldn't shake the feeling that whoever she was, she knew something the rest of them didn't. What happened next because of her would stun the entire world. Just a few hours earlier, Flight 780 had taken off as nothing more than a routine journey across the Atlantic. Families were settling in with blankets and cartoons. Business travelers tapped on laptops. A couple argued softly over which movie to watch. The plane was a floating snapshot of everyday life, ordinary, peaceful, predictable. Somewhere in the middle rows sat a woman named Elena Torres. Jeans, casual sweater, hair tied simply at the back, nothing about her stood out. She looked like anyone else preparing for a long flight. Relaxed shoulders, quiet expression, earbuds resting on her lap. No one knew her name, no one noticed her. And no one, not even the crew, had any idea that this quiet woman carried a past built on secrets, strategy, and survival. A past she thought she had left far behind. But that peace shattered the moment the first scream pierced the cabin. The hijackers rose from their seats with terrifying precision, pulling weapons from beneath their jackets. People froze in disbelief. This couldn't be real. Not here. Not now. The hijackers pushed forward, shouting commands, threatening anyone who moved. Fear swallowed the plane whole, yet Elena did the unthinkable. Instead of reacting like everyone else, she lowered her gaze, controlled her breathing, and almost seemed to sink into herself. Not in fear, no. It was preparation. It was calculation. She wasn't panicking. She was analyzing, and from the cockpit camera, Captain Reynolds saw her. A single still shape in a sea of terror. He didn't know her story yet, but he would soon. Everyone would. Because the moment those terrorists took over, the fate of the entire plane didn't fall into the hands of the hijackers. It quietly fell into the hands of the woman who refused to be afraid. The first gunshot wasn't fired, but the threat of it was enough to freeze the air. One hijacker grabbed a senior passenger by the collar, throwing him into a seat so hard the tray table snapped off. Another fired a warning burst into the ceiling panel, showering sparks and screams across the aisle. The cabin that once hummed with quiet conversations now echoed with panic and uncontrollable cries. A mother shielded her daughter with shaking arms while a businessman attempted to plead with the attackers, only to be silenced with a brutal shove. The leader of the group stepped forward, tall, steady, eyes burning with purpose. His voice cracked through the terror like a whip. Everyone stays seated. Anyone moves, dies. Even the engines seemed quieter beneath his words. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds watched the scene through the surveillance camera, powerless but alert. His gaze stopped on one strange detail amid the chaos. The woman in row 14 still hadn't moved. While the rest of the plane drowned in fear, she sat with the posture of someone silently preparing for a moment only she understood. And the captain felt a shiver of certainty. This wasn't the first time she had faced danger like this. Elena Torres had always believed she left her old life behind. Years of covert work had trained her to read faces before words, to detect danger before footsteps, to breathe steady when the world held its breath. But after a decade of missions that never made headlines, she walked away. She traded coded operations for simple days, quiet routines, and the comfort of being a nobody. But fate had followed her onto Flight 782. As the hijackers seized control, Elena lowered her gaze, knowing that panic draws attention and attention gets you killed. Her mind rebuilt the battlefield in seconds, number of attackers, their weapon handling, their emotional stability, the cracks in their formation. She noticed the youngest of them first, hands trembling, shoulders tight, eyes darting, a boy trying to look like a soldier. She understood instantly. He wasn't committed. He was scared. Fear, she knew, could either make someone dangerous or make them vulnerable. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply watched, breathed, and waited. Every second she stayed invisible increased her advantage. The hijackers controlled the plane, but Elena controlled her mind. And in situations like this, a stable mind was far more dangerous than a loaded weapon. When the youngest hijacker approached her row, his gun shook more than his voice. He shouted at the passengers to stay down, but his eyes flicked nervously from face to face, as if searching for reassurance he would never receive. As he passed Elena, she tilted her head slightly, just enough for him to notice, not enough to draw the leader's attention. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut straight into his fear. "You don't want this." The boy stiffened, startled, confused. His eyes widened for a moment before he barked at her to shut up, but the seed had been planted. She looked away as if nothing happened, knowing he would replay that moment again and again. Minutes later, the leader grabbed the boy angrily for hesitating to secure a passenger. The humiliation made him flinch. Elena watched the boy's mask crack, further fear, guilt, and doubt fighting inside him. She had manipulated trained killers before. Manipulating a frightened recruit was a different game entirely. On the outside, she looked calm. Inside, she could feel the shift beginning. Cracks were forming in the hijackers' unity. And once cracks begin, collapse is only a matter of time. The plane's unplanned landing for refueling became the breaking point. Ground negotiators tried stalling, offering water, supplies, anything to buy time. But inside the aircraft, tensions reached a dangerous peak. The leader was yelling, the group was arguing, and panic rippled through the passengers like an invisible wave. Elena took her chance as the young hijacker walked past again, sweat beading on his forehead. She leaned just enough to speak only to him. "They will kill you too," she said calmly. "They don't care if you live. You're just a tool." His breath hitched, the gun dipped slightly. "That's not true," he whispered back, voice cracking. Elena shook her head slowly. "Help me stop them, help yourself. This ends one of two ways, and their way is the one where you don't survive." He swallowed hard, fear replacing the false courage he had worn like a mask. Minutes later, when the plane was airborne again, he returned quietly, pretending to check seatbelts. His voice trembled as he leaned toward Elena, barely audible. "What do I do?" In that moment, the balance of power shifted. The terrorists still thought they controlled the plane, but the woman they ignored now held their downfall in her hands. Night swallowed the plane as it crossed the dark stretch of ocean. Most passengers sat slumped in exhausted terror, too drained to cry. The hijackers grew careless, believing resistance had died, but Elena's focus sharpened. Every detail the boy whispered, weapon locations, shift patterns, blind spots mapped themselves in her mind like a blueprint. Then, just past midnight, the moment arrived. The leader turned away for a fraction of a second to reprimand the boy for dropping his weapon. That single heartbeat of distraction was all Elena needed. She exploded from her seat with quiet, deadly precision. Her elbow cracked into the nearest hijacker's wrist, sending his gun spinning across the aisle. Gasps erupted, chaos ignited. The second man lunged, but Elena was already moving, snatching a seatbelt buckle and driving it into his cheekbone with brutal accuracy. The impact dropped him instantly. Passengers ducked as bodies clashed, as Elena twisted, struck, and neutralized her targets with the cold efficiency of someone who had lived this life too long. The leader finally reached for his gun, but Aelina pinned it with her boot and locked him in a chokehold so precise he had no chance to fight back. When he collapsed, silence swept the cabin. For the first time in hours, Flight 782 was free. When the hijackers lay defeated and their weapons scattered uselessly across the aisle, the passengers finally exhaled the breaths they had been holding for hours. Some cried, some prayed. Others simply stared at Aelina, unable to understand how a single woman had turned the impossible into reality. The crew rushed to secure the terrorists with whatever restraints they could find: belts, cords, even headphone wires. Captain Reynolds' voice came through the speakers, shaky but full of relief. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are safe." Thanks to one extraordinary passenger, those words echoed through the cabin long after the adrenaline faded. The plane landed under military escort, lights flashing across the runway as rescue teams surrounded the aircraft. Reporters swarmed the terminal, governments issued statements, and news stations replayed the footage endlessly. "Mysterious woman saves hundreds," the headlines read. But Aelina Torres slipped away before any camera could catch her. She declined interviews, rejected awards, and disappeared into the crowd as quietly as she had lived. She didn't want fame, she didn't need gratitude. Saving lives had never been about recognition, it was simply who she was, and so the legend grew. The calm woman on Flight 782, the passenger who refused to be afraid. The hero who stunned the world at 34,000 feet.